Yeah, now's not the time to figure out those things. Sure. Well, thank you for having me. Um, Probably have about an hour or two of material, so we will we'll do what we can. Thank you for having me. Uh, Thank you for the invitation. I should say when Pastor Herr invited me to do this, he said, you know, maybe we can commemorate the 500th anniversary or something. And so I thought we should commemorate the 500th anniversary of the three great Reformation treatises to the Babylonian captivity of the church. Or, sorry, now I mixed it up. To the Christian nobility of the German nation on the Babylonian captivity of the church and freedom of a Christian. These are, you know, seminal texts in the Lutheran tradition, so it seemed appropriate to mark them. And although there's a lot of other things happening in 1520, this is a great time to be a 16th century scholar because I get to celebrate the 500th anniversary of something, really pretty much my entire career. It's going to be slim pickings in a couple of decades. But for now, I get to celebrate great 500th anniversary. And yeah, these are very important texts, so I thought it would be appropriate to mark them, although there's a lot more happening, a lot of other things happening. 1520 is when Luther's threatened with excommunication. He famously burns the bull and all that. But these texts have an enormous influence, both immediately and down through the ages. So what I wanted to do then, you know, knowing we have three classes, the plan was to spend two on this one here, the Babylonian Captivity of the Church. This is in the New Fortress Press translation. I'm not sure, other than Eric, who will have read this or reread it for this particular class, but here it is. We'll spend two classes on the Babylonian captivity, one on the freedom of a Christian. I thought I'd initially try to set some sort of context. What's going on in the 16th century when this is written. That'll help us see why it's so important. And I'm particularly going to talk about Luther's publishing activity. And then from that, I was going to say a bit about the sacramental system that it rejects, the medieval sacramental system, and then exactly how Luther rejects it. This is, as students who take classes with me know, this is one of the big things I do. I try to help students understand, you know, what Luther is responding to, because it helps us see what's really important to him and what's really revolutionary about Lutheran teaching. So just first then, and always feel free to interrupt me as I speak. I don't mind. So first, in terms of context, this is a text that's written in 1520. So Luther is, as you know, he's a member of the Augustinian order. He is ordained, and he is a university professor of Bible. Begins teaching in 1513 in Wittenberg, and Wittenberg is not a particularly big deal at the time. It's a new university. He comes to be a public figure initially through academic disputations. The disputation against scholastic theology, September 1517, the 95 Theses, and then the Heidelberg disputation in the spring of 1518. Those are Latin texts. The 95 Theses are quickly translated into German, but their initial impact isn't so great because they're really complicated, as my students know. To actually read the 95 Theses and know what's happening in each one is complicated. Already in the spring of 1518, though, so a couple months after the 95 Theses, Luther learns to speak to the masses. He learns to speak to the masses. That's when he publishes his Sermon on Indulgence in Grace in German, a short treatise with basically, if you read these short German treatises, it says first, second, third. This is, you know, it really walks you through it. It's really for the people. And that was new. Taking theological controversy to the people was something new. As Luther then continues his work, moving forward 1518 to 1520, He's active on multiple fronts. He's continuing to lecture as a professor. Again, he's addressing the Psalms, as his first lectures were on the Psalms. He's engaged in controversial proceedings. He meets with Cajetan in 1518. The Leipzig Disputation is in 1519. He's writing controversial works. And he's writing a lot of short vernacular works that try to address the fundamentals of teaching and piety. The fundamental catechism and piety. So he publishes works in 1519 on marriage, on devotion to the passion, which was a ubiquitous aspect of medieval piety. He publishes a treatise on preparing to die, another central concern of medieval piety. How do you die so that you know you're headed in the right way instead of the wrong way? He publishes an exposition of the Lord's Prayer for the simple layperson. He publishes a cycle of treatises on the sacraments, on penance, baptism, and the Lord's Supper. A lot of what's said there comes into here, and a lot of what's in here comes into the catechism. Comes into the catechism. So in 1520, he also publishes a famous book on good works, which sought to explain why people who were saved by grace through faith would actually do good work. So I think it's been rightly said that Luther presented himself and would have been received by lay people first and foremost as a pastor, as someone who wanted to console consciences troubled by sin and by fear of eternal damnation. He presents himself first as a pastor. People know about the controversy with Rome. They know about his effort to reform church teaching, but he has a vernacular publishing program that's directed to the anxiety and the concrete practice of lay people, including married lay people, which is pretty extraordinary for a mendicant who's pretty much, you know, as has been pointed out, if you were a mendicant and a university professor like Luther or like Aquinas, you pretty much occupied an all boys world. You were surrounded by brothers in the cloister, and there were only men in the university. So it's pretty extraordinary that someone like that is coming out and trying to talk to domestic life. Then comes 1520. And what you get are these three programmatic treatises that are something very different, that lay out why we need reform of teaching and practice, what those reforms should be, and how to do it. Collectively, they do those three things. So the Christian Nobility of the German Nation was published in August 1520. At the end, Luther announces he's going to write to the Babylonian Captivity of the Church. October 1520 is when it appears. The Freedom of a Christian around the same time. The letter to the Christian nobility is written in German, the Babylonian Captivity in Latin and quickly translated. The Freedom of a Christian is kind of written in both. He writes a Latin outline, he writes a German version based on the Latin outline, and then he writes a full Latin version. So it's released in both languages. And as I said, there's a lot of other things going on. The bull against Luther threatening excommunication if he doesn't recant already comes in the summer. It's published by Luther's supporters in August. It reaches Wittenberg in October. But he hasn't been formally excommunicated yet when he writes these treatises, and he hasn't been summoned to Worms yet. So that's all still coming. These treatises are hugely significant. They make a comprehensive case for reform. Luther is no longer a renegade professor who's trying to persuade the church and trying to teach people how to endure a bad system. You see a little of that in this treatise still, the Babylonian Captivity. Well, if your priest won't give you both kinds, you're okay. And this is what you should do. And we should put up with bad practices as long as they don't lead us astray, so on and so forth. But he's really got a program for reform here, and he's acting with in a politically savvy way. He tries to enlist the broader public and temporal authorities to actually bring about reform, because he knows Rome isn't going to call a general council. The treatises are tightly interconnected, the three treatises. It's often remarked that the Freedom of a Christian is remarkably unpolemical. Oh, it's kind of this ethereal, above the fray treatise. There's even a conciliatory letter to the Pope at the beginning. That's true, sort of, but you have to juxtapose the freedom of the Christian to the Babylonian captivity, right? The Christian has to be free because they're captive to Babylon. And Babylon is the Pope, or it's the papacy. That's why the Christian needs to be free. And to the Christian nobility is a program for breaking down the imperviousness of Rome to reform. So these are three interconnected treatises. Good questions for us to ask, for you to ask as you read these treatises. What is the freedom of a Christian? Freedom is actually a theme that unites all these three texts. What is the freedom of a Christian? What is the freedom of the Christian church? Because there's clearly, it's not just a individual meaning here. Some later theologians mess it up because that's what later theologians always do. But so I get taking a shot at you, Eric. What is there is a freedom for the church as a whole. And what does it all mean for us today? How can Luther guide us today? I mentioned to the Christian nobility, I haven't planned on us reading that separately, just so you know what happens in that treatise. That's the first one that Luther publishes. He argues that the Romanists, the Roman hierarchy, has built three walls around it to prevent reform. Three walls around itself to prevent reform. One is the claim to rule over not only the spiritual, but the temporal realm. It's a long story, a complicated story, but essentially the papal claim to be able to tell governing authorities what to do. The second was the claim that the Pope gets to be supreme in the interpretation of Scripture. This is a big Catholic argument in the 16th century, right? Protestants said Scripture alone, and then none of them agreed on what Scripture means. That's pretty clear evidence that you need a Pope appointed by God to tell you what Scripture means. That's a big part of the 16th century debate. And then there was also the claim that only a Pope can summon a general council. And again, there's a huge, interesting history there. Dr. Christensen would know well. There's a debate in the Middle Ages over whether a Pope or a Council of Cardinals is the highest decision-making authority. But the Pope says, well, only I get to call a council, and therefore the Pope de facto ends up being the highest authority. All things we could talk about in a different context. Luther rejects those three walls, and it's in the Christian nobility where he famously introduces his idea of the priesthood of all believers. Everyone is spiritually equal. No one is set above somebody else to intercede for them. Clergy are set apart to administer the sacraments and preach the gospel. And so Luther, he's looking for a council to direct reforms, and he knows the Pope isn't going to call a council. And so he says, well, if we're a priesthood of all believers, everyone can call a council. The power to, well, not exactly. The power to call a council belongs to the whole church. And so he asked the temporal authorities to do it. The German princes. That's why it's a letter to the German princes. Ultimately, the reform doesn't happen in that way. But what it does show you is you know, the story of Luther as the professor who humbly posted some theses and things got out of control and, you know, gee, I didn't know what I was doing, is not exactly true. It's a politically savvy move because he knows he needs an authority to back his reform. And that's part of what's happening into the Christian nobility. Again, it shows you how these three Reformation treatises are interconnected. They name tyranny and outline a practical and doctrinal and spiritual program for dismantling. That then leads me to the Babylonian captivity. I see I've already talked longer than I planned. But I think it will be helpful to look at the medieval sacramental system. Are there questions or concerns at this point, or no? All right. Very, very hard to tell via Zoom. A little bit about the medieval sacramental teaching, because I want us to see how Luther is trying to totally reorient Christian life and devotion. You're having a shift from what I would call a penance-centered or mass-centered framework to one that I call a baptism-grounded framework. A baptism-grounded framework. So in the medieval understanding, your life is structured by the 7 sacraments. Your life is structured by 7 sacraments. When you're born, you inherit original sin. You want to get rid of that right away. And it's understood that there is a guilt and a penalty for original sin. Guilt means you're pronounced guilty and you deserve to go to hell. Penalty means that's the punishment, right? Just like if you're before a court and you're judged guilty, there's a penalty that's then imposed. So there's a guilt and a penalty. They both get wiped away with baptism. So you're good until you grow up. Because if you grow up, then you commit sin. You give into a bad desire, you commit sin, consent to concupiscence. And then you fall into a state of sin, if it's a mortal sin. And then you got to get back into a state of grace with God. This is, again, the medieval understanding. I always underline that because, they sometimes have students who listen during the first part where I was outlining the medieval understanding and then, got bored of me by the second part of class. And then they just, okay, so we go to penance in order to get reconciled with God. No. But in the medieval understanding, when you commit a sin, when you commit an actual sin, when you consent to concupiscence, it's complex if you really want to dive into it. You fall into a state of grace, a state of alienation with God, and you have to be reconciled. And that's what you go to penance for. That's what you go to confession for. You're supposed to be really sorry for your sin. That means contrite. And you're supposed to tell the priest everything you did. At least everything you can recall, and then the priest absolves you. And that gets rid of your guilt. This guilt penalty distinction is really important. It gets rid of your guilt, and you won't go to hell if you die then. However, the penalty, you still owe God something. You still owe God something. So you begin to do what are called works of satisfaction, which may be, saying 10 Hail Marys or maybe going on a pilgrimage. It depends on what you did, and it depends on whether you go to the hard priest or the easy priest. And who's who. Who's who. Depends on whether you go to a hard confessor or an easy confessor. You might want the hard one, though, because here's the kicker. If you don't work off all your satisfactions here and now, you pay for them in purgatory. You pay for them in purgatory. You have to make it up. And under worse conditions, it takes longer, it's harder, it hurts a little more in purgatory to make up your satisfactions for God. You're still going to get to heaven, it just may take you 1,000 to 1,000,000 years. And that's how it goes in the medieval understanding. Then after you've confessed and been forgiven, only then can you receive the Eucharist, because otherwise you might be unworthy. And for the ordinary Christian in the medieval period, they would have alternated between states of grace and states of sin. Ideally, you keep going up, but in reality, you commit one of the 7 deadly sins, because they're not murder, theft, and adultery. They are pride, envy, lust, and so forth. And you fall out of a state of grace, and then you got to go to penance to get back into a state of grace. And then you can receive the Eucharist, so on and so forth. But then you're probably going to fall out again. And you're probably going to have to go back to penance. This is why a sudden death is terrifying in the Middle Ages. Especially terrifying because you don't have an opportunity to confess. You don't have an opportunity to confess. And I'm saying all this because, there's a lot of debates over were people really terrified in the Middle Ages. And of course, there were people who were just kind of like, meh. I'll confess at the end. There's always a there's the there's the low way, there's the low road to heaven, and there's the highway to heaven. Plenty of people on the low road here and not particularly interested. But there were some people who were tormented by the system, including Luther. I always remind my students, if you think of the lightning storm story that Luther later told, he was in a lightning storm and vowed to Saint Anne that he would become a monk. Well, if he's struck suddenly dead, it's not just that he's dead, he's in danger of hell because he hasn't had a chance to confess. There's that layer of that story that I think we readily miss. So that's the medieval system in a very short overview. This is where indulgences come in. Indulgences don't get you out of hell. What they do is they get you out of those satisfactions, right, that you're supposed to render to God. They get you out of those satisfactions. So you confess, you're forgiven, you can receive the Eucharist, but you still owe God something, and you're going to pay it now or in purgatory. That's where indulgences come in. And again, there's a long history there, but I don't want to spend the whole time. I don't want to spend the whole time talking about that. There's a lot here we could cover on the Mass. I'm famous for over-preparing. Although it might make sense to, in fact, kind of delay that a bit and maybe work on the Mass a bit next week, to make sure we talk a bit about Luther's revolution. What's he changing in the Babylonian captivity? It's here where he just rejects fundamentally that sacramental system. He's done it already. I said he wrote 3 treatises on penance, baptism, and the Lord's Supper in 1519. He's made all the arguments, but he's really pulling them together into an effective single treatise here. I admire this treatise because he changes his mind at the end. And this is where he's sort of like, penance is a sacrament. Actually, no, it's not. He gets to the end of the book and he changes his mind, right? As an academic today, you don't get to do that. If you change your mind at the end, you got to go back and write the beginning over. But I admire Luther's audacity in just changing his mind mid-treatise. The thing to note about the medieval system, Luther's critique of it, is think about all the places where it instills anxiety. Think about all the places where it instills anxiety. If you were living in that system. Am I in a state of mortal sin today? You're a lay person, you wake up, am I in a state of mortal sin today? Probably. Almost certainly. Then you go to confession. Did I confess properly? That's an anxiety, because you gotta really be sorry. There's a lot of debate over exactly how sorry, but you gotta be sorry. And you gotta try to tell the priest everything. There's a lot of debate over exactly what that means, but you probably should tell the priest everything. So you got to worry about whether you've confessed properly. Once you've confessed, you got to render those satisfactions. You got to worry if you have done enough satisfaction. If you went to the easy priest and you said 10 Hail Marys to get off, to render satisfaction for your theft of many of your neighbor's things, you can be sure your priest didn't impose enough satisfaction, and you probably have a long wait in purgatory when you die. You have to worry about how long you're going to suffer in purgatory. You have to worry about whether you're going to die in a state of grace, whether you're going to die with unconfessed mortal sin. This is one of the reasons Luther publishes a treatise on the art of dying in 1519, because it's such an anxious thing. It's such an anxious thing, right? People, you have to, on your deathbed, you typically would have confessed and then receive the Eucharist and then receive extreme unction. But right? Luther wants to take anxiety out of that moment. And Luther's breakthrough in this treatise involves seeing God as a God of promises. and a God of completely reliable promises. God, as our creator, promises to sustain us. God promises to redeem us on account of Christ alone. That means our relationship to God is about our trust, our faith in God. For Luther, faith is trust, because a promise can only be received in trust. Someone promises me something, then I either trust in that promise, or I think they're not telling me the truth. Or I think they're not telling me the truth. You know, Luther says, when we don't trust God, we call God a liar. We call God a liar. And that's strong language, but it reflects the idea that God has promised to save us on account of what Christ has done and on account of our baptism. And when we don't trust in that, we're not believing God's promise, even though God's 100% reliable. And it's from that foundation that he, in this treatise and elsewhere, redefines what a sacrament is. What makes a sacrament is that Christ commands us to do it, and there's a promise attached to it. What ultimately becomes formalized in Lutheran doctrine, there has to be an element, a physical element, an institution of Christ, and a promise. In baptism, the promise is forgiveness on account of Christ. That changes what Christian life becomes. It becomes a matter of clinging to that promise whenever you're tempted to despair. Versus alternating between state of grace, state of sin, state of grace, state of sin, state of grace, state of sin. What state am I in? I'm in a state of sin. I got to get back into my state of grace, so on and so forth. For Luther, whenever you're anxious about sin, you've got to cling to your baptismal promise. So it alters fundamentally the character of Christian life, again, from sort of penance-centered to baptism-centered. But Luther calls that liberty, but he says it's liberty that has been taken captive because the papacy has bound Christians to all sorts of rules that they need to fulfill for their salvation, including rules surrounded by confession. And so and this last thing I say, this will work well. We can turn to the Mass next week. You get a complete reworking of confession too. So if you have this edition, it's pages 63 and 64. You see him dealing with an old idea of Jerome, that confession is a second plank after baptism. What that meant is basically when you're baptized, you get on a safe, happy ship through the waters of life, and you're good. But you sin, and the ship breaks up. The ship breaks up. You fall into the water, and so you cling to a floating plank that happens to be confession in order to not drown in this sea of life. And Luther rejects that. The ship is baptism, and it never breaks up. The problem is we fall off, or we more or less forget that we are baptized and forgiven on account of that. So with all that, then there's lots of passages we can look at. I've already talked a little too longer than I wanted. So I will kick it to you all for questions, concerns, or what have you.